I am an academic. I work up in as a senior lecturer in events and tourism at Robert Gordon University, which is based in Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland, for those that might not know. But I've had an interest in the paranormal for quite a while now, probably more sort of, I suppose, specifically started researching the paranormal in about 2007. I was part of a paranormal investigation group when I was an undergraduate student up in Aberdeen. And then more formally started, or academically started, researching the paranormal when I commenced my PhD at the University of York in 2010. And I have, I suppose, two different interests in the paranormal. Firstly, the one that I'm going to be speaking about tonight, which is really around how people make sense of paranormal experiences through social interaction. This was the basis of my thesis and PhD, which I completed in 2016. But the reason I also wanted to speak about this today is it's fresh in my mind. Myself and Robin Woofert are just finishing off a book at the moment that we're sending, hopefully, for publication next week. So it's one of those things that I've kind of been wrapped up in the last few weeks, and I suppose it's as fresh as it can be in those sort of final stages. My second interest is looking at supernatural experiences in contemporary society, and more specifically, I suppose, looking at supernatural storytelling and how that helps us to engage with heritage, and also is used as a form of tourism as well. And I guess my interest in that is sort of linked to my job role in terms of teaching and tourism and sort of heritage side of it and events, and is my sort of covert way, I suppose, of continuing to be a spooky academic whilst teaching in other subject areas as well. So as I say, I'm going to focus on the first area of research this evening. And I just thought it would be useful to maybe start off with a little bit of a personal anecdote to really explain where my interest in particularly the sort of social interaction side of things came from. So when I mentioned that I was part of a paranormal group back in 2007, and like, you know, many paranormal investigation groups, we did investigations around Aberdeen and the northeast of Scotland, and travelled to locations, spent the night there collecting sort of evidence and people's stories about the hauntings that took place there. There was one location in particular that we spent quite a lot of time investigating, which is an old prison in Aberdeen called the Toll Booth. And there was one particular occasion that we were investigating there. And it was the middle of the night. We had decided to go on a break, or me and another investigator, decided to go on a break. The rest of the group had sort of gone off into other areas of the building. And there was one particular room that we were standing in whilst we were having the break, and it had a sort of archway into a room next to it. We were standing there and we were having a chat and eating a chocolate bonbon biscuit. If Dylan Jones is on the call today, he'll know I'm a big advocate of eating biscuits on investigations. And as we were standing there and just chatting casually, I started to get the impression that there was somebody standing in the doorway, and it was somewhere between, I suppose, an impression and seeing something that was there. But it was late at night and I kind of dismissed it, personally thinking it was probably just something that I was imagining at that particular point. And it wasn't until the investigator that was standing with me turned around and asked if I could also see somebody standing in the doorway, that it obviously became a sort of interesting experience. And we had a chat about what we could both see, and we both sort of came to the conclusion that we were experiencing a similar thing. And it was one of those experiences. It wasn't scary. It sort of came and went fairly quickly, and it wasn't particularly significant in terms of what happened. But it stuck with me as an experience because it had that sort of collective dimension to it, and the fact that we'd kind of come to this confirmation that we'd had this similar experience together. So it was really leading on from that experience that I became interested in this sense of how people make sense of experiences together, and what the role of social interaction is in coming to a sort of collective interpretation of what those events are. Before I go on to sort of get into the, I suppose, the bones of the presentation, I thought it would be useful to start with a few statements which I think really kind of foreground the kind of ideas that I want to talk about today. And the first of these is that the mundane is important to understanding the extraordinary. And I think sometimes when we are, studying these kind of experiences that have such a extraordinary dimension to them, that it's easy to become quite caught up in the sort of that sort of fantastic, exciting, interesting side of these experiences, when actually it's easy to forget that enmeshed in that is these kind of mundane things. So how we talk about them, how we interact, what is going on around us can often be actually quite ordinary at the same time. And that's a particularly important point for what I'm sort of go on to discuss. In addition to that, I also want to kind of talk about the role of bodies as being more than vessels for the mind, but acting as a resource through which sense-making occurs. And that bodies are not only present in strange places, but they're actually also actively involved in sort of expanding how places become seen and understood as being extraordinary. And finally, I want to talk about this idea that interpretations of collective paranormal events are collaborative and often co-produced. They don't necessarily happen in isolation for an individual, but are made up of these sort of social activities that happen all around them. And I really like this quote by Ghidini, so I wanted to just share it here. A fascinating paper if you haven't come across it, and you can get access to it. It came out in 2019. It's actually about crop circles and how people make sense of crop circles. But Ghidini says how people employ their creative capacities to construct spiritual experience out of the sometimes seemingly mundane and profane artifacts, and in the context of often opposing cultural contexts and bases of rationality, offers a fascinating illumination of the social spirit. Okay, so I'm interested in collective experience, as I've mentioned, and how people make sense of those experiences together. And there's, of course, lots of perspectives to take in terms of studying collective experiences, many of which involve an interest in the mind or group dynamics, as well as other approaches. However, I'm interested in a more specific focus, which is that moment-by-moment interactions that occur during paranormal experiences. I think this is important to state because this perspective does not consider necessarily who these people are, their backgrounds, their intentions, their beliefs, and nor does it attempt to make any kind of ontological assumptions about the reality of those experiences and whether they are real or not. It's simply interested in what is happening during interaction, when it happens, and what happens next. To analyse this in my research, which looked at paranormal investigation groups having experiences, I draw on a perspective from the social sciences, which is concerned with micro-level interaction. It's known as conversation analysis, or CA. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go into lots of details about conversation analysis, as I appreciate it's perhaps not as much interest to the audience that are going to be here today, many audiences actually. But I do want to just show you what this type of analysis looks like, to explain how the findings that I've come to today or arrived at have come into being, and also to illustrate a different methodology for studying experiences that might be unfamiliar to some. If you are interested in knowing more about conversation analysis, there are some really good books out there. I've included one on the right-hand side there, which is co-authored by Robin, who's my former PhD supervisor, on the right. And then on the left, you'll see there's a sample transcript from a paranormal experience. I'm going to come back to this particular transcript later to explain what's going on. However, what you'll probably notice at the moment is this is quite similar to an interview transcript in many ways. It records what people have said. But it also does something a little bit different and goes a little further. So it also records how people say what they say. So for instance, the little carrés or little arrows you can see around month-ob there in line 79 indicate a rise in tone, so month-ob. The numerous H's that you can see in line 83 are an audible exhale, so that's somebody going, oh, Jesus. And square brackets indicate overlapping talk and action, and that's particularly of interest to conversation analysis, as these are considered to be forms of turn-taking and interruptions in talk, as somebody speaks and then the next person speaks perhaps over the top of that person. And the letters that you can see beside them on the left-hand side indicate who is speaking. I'm not going to say too much more about the technicalities of conversation analysis, but I just really wanted to note here that it's this orderliness of conversation and action that's important to how interaction is analysed, and it's relevant to what I'm going to be speaking about next. So what can studying interaction at this level, this micro level that I'm speaking about, tell us about paranormal experiences? Before I go on to talk about my own research, I just want to illustrate a couple of studies that have used this type of analysis to reveal interesting things about how we report experiences. So in Robin Wooffort's earlier research on accounts, and you may have come across this study before, he examines the ways that people tell others about their experiences. So he studied the way that people report experiences to others and noticed something quite interesting about the way that people present these accounts. So one particular feature that he noticed was a device called "I was just doing X when Y." And he noticed that there seemed to be a pattern of people reporting their participation in doing something mundane or ordinary when something strange or extraordinary occurred. So for instance, someone might say, "I was just washing the dishes when I had a strange feeling as if someone was watching me," or "I was just sitting down eating dinner with the kids when I noticed a dark shadow pass by the doorway." I think it's quite interesting to just reflect on whether you do this yourself when you're reporting experiences. I know I certainly do. And when I think back to the earlier personal anecdote that I was giving out earlier, I used that format. So I said I was standing in a room, I was eating a chocolate biscuit, and I was chatting to the other investigator when something strange happened. Now, rather than being just a way of telling, Woofort suggests that this actually has interesting interactional consequences. For instance, by presenting an account in this way, the teller positions themselves as someone who's not explicitly looking for something paranormal to happen at that time, but was caught up in this kind of extraordinary moment in everyday life. They also demonstrate that they were alert and conscious to their activities at that specific moment, that they can remember them, and therefore demonstrate their capacity to recall these experiences with clarity. And these things are important in reporting paranormal experiences. They help to present the teller as someone who was sort of not primed for that experience to occur at that time, and also that they can recall it clearly, and therefore lends further credibility to their claim. And it also suggests that individuals are somewhat culturally aware of the skepticism that might be attributed to their accounts and structure these in such a way to mitigate against them. Childs and Murray's, just on the right side there, also explored how investigators from paranormal groups account for their experiences after an investigation. They also noticed particular ways in which these accounts were presented to illustrate that the investigators employed rational and logical thinking, and the accounts were often collaboratively constructed. So one person might speak and then the other would come in to help fill in parts of the account. They might support the claims, or they might offer assessments. This demonstrated a kind of intersubjectivity to the experience, and the fact that it occurs collectively suggests that it was out there to be experienced rather than perhaps being attributed to a psychological state of mind. They also noticed that paranormal claims were often implied but rarely explicitly labelled. So investigators didn't really explicitly say that they had seen a ghost, but might imply that by countering plausible explanations with the paranormal potential being possible. So in both of these studies, analysing how people talk about their experience reveals quite interesting things about the way reports about the paranormal are constructed to demonstrate rationality and credibility for the witnesses and the paranormal potential of the events that have unfolded. Studying interaction at this level can therefore tell us interesting things about the way that people might orientate and construct accounts of paranormal experiences in the light and presence of other people around them. So today, I want to present some of my own research into the interactions of paranormal groups during investigation, and specifically the moment-by-moment interactions when an experience occurs. Rather than focus on talk, like in the previous studies I've mentioned, I want in this talk to pay particular attention to the body and its importance in highlighting, negotiating, and making sense of extraordinary events. One of the reasons I want to focus on this is because whilst the body has been the focus of some research in the paranormal, this is often from the perspective of embodiment rather than a focus of actually the body in action. And of course, by proxy, the body has been studied in relation to the mind or the subjective qualities of experiences, but there's quite limited research focusing on the role as a body as a tool for sense making during experiences as they occur. And yet the body is hugely important to how we experience the paranormal and is often at the heart of evidential claims. If we take reincarnation, for instance, and reflect on some of Ian Stevenson's pioneering research into claims of reincarnation, these claims are often based on the presence of birth or unusual markings on the body. Individuals may also claim to feel through their body that they were someone else or continue to experience trauma on or in the body related to events of a previous life. From an experimental perspective, the body is often subject of investigation or manipulation in parapsychological research. The Gansfield experiment, for instance, isolates bodies from other bodies, subjects them to various sensory deprivation, and claims of experience are often related to experiences of the body. And finally, the paranormal investigation groups, which are the focus of this talk today, use their bodies in various ways to carry out investigations. So like the groups that we see on the screen here, bodies are used to orientate to each other and spaces in the environment. Certain investigatory techniques are reliant on the positioning of multiple bodies in specific formats. So for instance, things like seances and Ouija boards often rely on the sort of formation of multiple bodies in a circle. And tools and equipment are used that require tactile and spatial interaction, which are performed by the body. And of course, subjective experiences form part of paranormal investigations as well, where people have experiences on or in the body as part of those occurrences. So bodies are then important to the way that experiences occur and are evidenced, and also to the way that they're communicated and shared. To illustrate this further, I'm going to focus on 3 actions regularly performed by groups that appear to be important to this idea of making sense of paranormal events. So I'm going to, in the next few slides, look at pointing, gesturing, and expressions of feeling. And these things might seem particularly mundane, even uninteresting, but I hope that sort of in the next few slides, I can kind of convince you, or at least pique your interest, that these are actually important to understanding collective experiences. So we'll start with pointing then. So during investigations and when an experience occurs, so for instance, a strange sound in the environment, it's common for groups to point towards, often with their hands, but also sometimes with their heads, particularly if they're holding hands as part of a seance, stuff like that, to specific spaces in the environment. So on the screen, you'll see 3 sort of pictures with very sort of text around them. These pictures are from a very short section of video, and they're screenshots of this sort of interaction taking place. In the example that's illustrated here, the group are investigating a reputedly haunted prison, actually the prison that I was talking about earlier. They've called out for the spirits to let them know that they are present by producing a sound, and have waited in relative silence for a response. A short while later, there is a large bang which is heard from the room next to the one that the groups are located in. Group member A, who is positioned sort of off the left of the screen that you can see there, says, where did that come from? And in response, B, who you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, lifts his hand as almost if to say it wasn't him, and points out of the room towards the possible location of the sound and says, over. Now, at first glance, this seems pretty normal. They're pointing towards the space that the event occurred in. We do this every day to highlight to others things in the environment we'd like them to pay attention to. These are called in academic terms dietic gestures, and they're part of the everyday gestures that we use to reference things all around us. However, in paranormal investigations, where people point is important. So if B had pointed towards another member of the group, this implies that the sound may have originated from the space around that particular person, and as such may have a normal explanation. There is a rational possibility. The point out of the room to an empty space, however, carries with it a particular transgressive quality. If the sound originated from an empty space, it does not, at least obviously, carry a rational explanation, and its paranormal potential is somewhat implied. So pointing towards empty space is a regular device observed in paranormal investigations for highlighting where an event occurred, but also initiating further conversation about the event in making sense of it. Empty spaces become relevant to the conversation of paranormal experiences through these bodily actions and become an important feature in understanding the potential of an event as having paranormal qualities. So in addition to pointing, investigators also use the hands to produce gestures when talking about the features of events. In the illustrated example on this slide, the group are participating in a Ouija board session. Shortly before this particular abstract, several members of the group have heard what they consider to be a scratching sound. The sound's highlighted by a group member, and then the space to the right of E, who is the person that you can see on the right-hand side of the screenshots there, is pointed at by B, you can just see her arm on the left-hand side. Initially, one of the group members suggests that the sound may have come from A, who's located right at the end of the table, or the furthest person that you can see in the screenshots. However, this is dismissed, firstly by B re-pointing to the space to the right of E rather than at A, to confirm that it came from the empty space or the uninhabited space and not from A herself, and therefore somewhat implying that there isn't something in that area that could have produced that scratching sound. And then both B and E describe the sound. B suggests that it was like a dog scratching, and E overlaps this talk with her own description, stating that it was high-pitched. At the end of her turn, she states like ch-ch-ch-ch, and uses her hand to mimic a dog scratching itself. The gesture produced here alongside the point towards empty space is significant. It illustrates that the sound differs from A scratching herself, which would have been a rational explanation, and instead implies that its unusual qualities are not expected in the space that occurred. So we know that there wasn't a dog in that particular space at that particular time, and there wasn't anything else that could potentially have caused that high-pitched sound. So therefore the implication is that it could be paranormal. So like pointing, these body gestures are also common in paranormal investigations, and their production helps groups negotiate the features of an experience and collectively derive its status as normal or paranormal. And finally, I'd like to just return to the first extract that I showed you when we were talking about conversation analysis. In this extract, the group have also been using a Ouija board, which has spelled out the word, or what's confirmed to actually be the name of the spirit, which is Monthop. So A and B both address the spirit, and at this point, the Gauss meter, which is positioned behind the group, starts to increase in volume. C considers this to be confirmation of the spirit's name. As she says, it's definitely Monthop. As she does this, she produces her utterance. B interrupts it by letting out an audible exhale and stating Jesus. At this time, she closes her eyes and she leans towards the table, and this is noticed by A and C. And when C asks if she's okay, B squints her eyes again and suggests that her eyes might be watering. The personal and subjective experience accounted by B to the ongoing activity of the group is displayed through her talk and body actions. She leans forward, she closes her eyes, she squints her eyes, and she exhales. Her actions imply quite an intense internal experience, one which is enough to make her eyes water, and which seems to occur in parallel to the Gauss meter, which is positioned behind her, increasing in volume, and the spirit being identified as Monthop. And perhaps one of the challenges of paranormal experiences is that they often are subjective in quality. They're rarely seen in quite the ways that are portrayed in the movies, but rather manifest as chills, feelings, being touched, inner sensations, and so on. And while on paranormal investigations, we do observe outward experiences, such as the sounds that we explored in the previous two examples, these subjective experiences also form a significant part of evidencing the paranormal. So as we observe here, the body is used as a resource to share and communicate these experiences and transpose them from a private experience for an individual to one that becomes part of the collective activity. The experience encountered by B here becomes, through her actions, part of that wider interpretation of the event. The potential presence of the spirit is seen not just in light of the Ouija board activity and the Gauss meter reaction, but also the subjective experience of B. Indeed, my analysis has shown that by using the body to display inner experience, the individual may not only share their own experience, but by communicating this, engender others to have similar experiences themselves. So my argument here is that the body is important to understanding how groups collectively make sense of paranormal events. Hopefully you can see from these examples that actions performed on and by the body help investigators to make visible experiences, even if the phenomena itself is not. Demarcate spaces in the environment as relevant to an experience and imply a paranormal potential to them. And use gestures to establish the features and quality of an experience that in turn helps to collaboratively make sense of an event and determine if it is paranormal or not. By looking at experiences at this kind of micro level, we can also appreciate that group members are not passive in their encounters with ghosts. People are active collaborators in constructing how an experience is seen and understood. And that's not to make any ontological judgments about whether an experience is real or not. But as Mark Eaton suggests, ghosts are a social accomplishment. So that's kind of all I wanted to say today. As I mentioned, we do have a book that we're hoping will come out shortly. I've no idea when it's going to be released. We're sending it for publication next week, but it's going to explore some of these issues in a lot more detail. It's called Making Sense of the Paranormal, the Interaction and Construction of Unexplained Experiences. As I say, will be out at some point, I imagine in the next kind of 6 months to a year. I can let people know when that is.